everyone. My name is Cameron, one of the kids ministers up here at St. Luke's, and it is great to be with you again. We hope that you had a good Easter last weekend as we had a moment to celebrate and remember the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus last Sunday. I hope that you got to celebrate that with your families. It was a bit different to how we would normally do it, but I do hope that Easter was good for you, and the most important things that Easter didn't change. That Easter is a moment to celebrate that Jesus is alive, that he paid for sin, and that he was resurrected back to life again. Today we're going to continue on with our story. After celebrating Easter last weekend, we're going to pick up kind of straight after on that first Easter, and we're going to focus in really on one disciple, one of Jesus' disciples, a man named Thomas. And now Thomas, he was one of the 12, 12 of Jesus' closest friends. I don't know how many of them you can name, but there were 12. There was Thomas, Matthew, James, John, Peter, Simon, another James, Bartholomew, Thaddeus, Judas, Andrew, and Philip. Now they spent kind of 3 years with Jesus. And they spent 3 years following, seeing what Jesus did, hearing what Jesus said. And they would have got to see some pretty amazing things. Last week, this is what we saw. We saw Jesus dying on a cross. The disciples kind of running away. You might remember that Peter, one of the other disciples, he said, "I don't even know Jesus." He said that 3 times. But then we saw that the kind of darkness of Good Friday was changed to light on Easter Sunday morning as some women, they go to the tomb where Jesus' body had been put. And when they get there, they found the stone rolled to the side. They found an angel sitting on the stone. And the angel said to him, you might remember this from last week, the angel said to the women, "He isn't here. He is risen." And so the women, they go and tell the other disciples what they have heard. Now we're going to jump forward to a moment when Jesus shows up. You see the disciples, they've gathered in this room again. 11 of them are there, but there is one man missing, and that is Thomas. So we don't really know what Thomas was doing. Maybe he was out fishing. We're not really sure, but he's not there at this moment. He's not there as these disciples, they gather together once more, and Jesus shows up. Jesus appears in this room to prove that he is alive again. And he talks with the disciples. The disciples see him and hear him. But then Jesus leaves again. And Thomas, he's missed all of it. He hasn't seen what the other disciples saw. And so when the disciples, they come and they say, "Thomas, we've seen Jesus alive," he doesn't believe them. He doesn't believe that Jesus is really alive, that he is back from the dead. He doubts. He doubts whether Jesus really is alive. And that kind of makes sense, I think. The others have seen it. Thomas hasn't. And he says, "I will only believe it if I see it with my own eyes." And so a whole week goes past. We read this in John, the end of John's Gospel. A week goes past, 8 days later. The disciples again are gathered together, as I'm sure they have been doing a lot during this week. But this time Thomas is there. This time Thomas isn't off doing whatever he was doing. This time he is there with the other disciples, and once again Jesus shows up. Once again Jesus comes and speaks to the disciples. And Jesus seeks out Thomas. Jesus goes out of his way to find Thomas and say, "Look, it is me." And he even says to Thomas, and it's kind of weird and a little bit gross, he says, "Put your fingers in the holes in my hand. Where the nails were, touch them. It really is me. I'm alive again." And so having seen, having heard, having touched, Thomas believes here is Jesus alive once more. See, Thomas's doubts turn into belief. Thomas's doubts turn into trust. And he really does believe that Jesus is alive again. And so Jesus spends some more time with them. with his disciples. We're going to see this again next week. And what I want to do, I want to just grab my Bible and read the last little bit, because Jesus says something not just for the disciples, but he also says something for us. See, Thomas, we saw he believes because he sees, but this is what Jesus says. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. This is John 20, verse 29. You see, Jesus, he says, Thomas, the other disciples who are there, well, you've believed me because you've seen me. But Jesus says, even more so, those who haven't seen me and still have believed. And what we see is that's us. We don't see him like we would see each other. But Jesus would say, blessed are those who haven't seen but still believe, who have heard what the disciples wrote down, who have heard the words of Jesus written down for us. And Jesus would say, blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. And so as we see these disciples, now after Thomas, they've all met Jesus again. They have seen him alive and they've all believed that it is him. They go, this is the Jesus who we were with. This is the Jesus who we spent 3 years with. If it wasn't him, they would have known. If it wasn't really Jesus, the disciples would have known it wasn't him. But they say, we've seen him, we've touched him, we've heard him. And so we believe that Jesus is alive again. And for Thomas, that changes everything. The doubts that he has get turned to belief. And so for us, as we once again read the Bible for ourselves, we're invited to believe as well, to keep trusting that Jesus really is alive. That what we looked at last week, the empty tomb, the angels saying he is risen, he is alive. We're invited to believe that for ourselves, to trust that Jesus really is the risen King of the whole world. Thomas believed, the other disciples believed, and so we can believe as well, trusting that Jesus really is alive. I really hope you have a really good week this week. Keep remembering who Jesus is, the risen King of the whole world. We have one more week next week in our Level Up series to wrap this up. We're going to see a couple more people who meet Jesus after the resurrection as well. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you soon.